Well, good morning, Dave here, and this is our Wednesday morning edition of devotions for our week of devotions leading up to Easter. And this morning we're going to be looking at John chapter 13, verses 21 through 32. And in this text it says, "After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, 'Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me.' The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of who he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, 'Lord, who is it?' Jesus answered, 'It is the one whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish.' So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, 'Do quickly what you are going to do.' Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought it was because Judas had the common purse, and Jesus was telling him, 'Buy what you need for the festival,' or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. When he had gone out, Jesus said, 'Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once.'" Interesting passage, and there's three things that I want us to take away from this morning. And the first one is that God cares about you. You see, when Jesus handed Judas the bread that was dipped, this was a sign of friendship in those times, and it was an intimate meal. And as you would do this, it was really a sign of some close friendship. And Jesus is telling Judas that you're my friend. You don't need to do this. And what we can take away from this is, if you're not a believer, that there's nothing that you've done in your life that Jesus can't forgive. He's always your friend. He's always calling you to him. And ultimately, it's your final decision as to whether you will be with him in eternity or not. For the believer, sometimes we get off track. We lose sight of where we are. We lose sight of the Lord. And what he's saying to us there is he is our friend, and we can come to him. There's nothing that we can tell him that would shock him or make him not be our friend. There's nothing that we could do, any kind of what we would consider a betrayal of him. He's always calling us and calling us back to him. So God cares about you, and this is very important as we live our Christian lives, because it gives us the freedom to be able to make mistakes. And we also have to make sure that we don't use this as a license to sin. But the bottom line is we learn from this that God cares about you. He loves you. And the second thing that we can take away from this is God's sovereignty. You can trust God. And this betrayal was not something that was out of Jesus' control. It was not out of hand. It was not out of God's hand. And he did not tell the disciples that he was with that one was going to betray him for the purpose of rooting that person out and taking care of him. It was for the purpose of letting them know that he knows what's going on. He's in perfect control. And that is so important, especially in days like we have today. We're being prohibited from meeting together because of the situation that we live in. But we can trust God. We know that this is in his hand, it's in his control. And just like the betrayal did not ruin his plan, for God's plan for what was going to happen for the redemption of mankind, neither can anything that comes into our lives, into our culture, ruin any plan of God. He is in perfect control. You can trust him. And the third thing that I want us to look at is at the end of the passage, it talks about glorifying God and glorifying Jesus. God is glorified through this, and what we mean by this is Jesus was accomplishing the final act on earth. The redemption of man. This was the final step. This has been talked about for thousands of years, and now it was time to exalt God, to magnify him, and that might be a better words for this word glorification, to lift him up and magnify him. So as we see Easter approaching, just as Jesus did at this time, he said, "It's done." He spoke in the past tense because it is done. That's how sure he is of what was going to happen. He said, the Son of Man is glorified, and so is the Father. And we can lift him up in all that we do, exalt God, magnify God, because we see what's coming. Every year we're celebrating this event that happened, and it's reason to glorify God, exalt him, magnify him, not only in the church or in our homes when we're watching the service online, but as we go about our daily lives, especially when we get back into our communities, in our workplaces, that in our speech and in our actions, we are to exalt God, we are to magnify God, we are to use his name when we can and not the way that others use it. But we want to lift God up, we want people to know him, we want him to be exalted in our lives, and this is a good time to remember that as we approach the Easter season. So have a good Wednesday. Enjoy your day. God bless.